Tonight we have a wonderful speaker.
Yeah! Let's go!
Brian Brew. He is a fourth-year PhD candidate now in political science over at UNC, and he will give our talk on community and Catholicism. So, warm welcome.
Woo! Yes, Charlie's got the right idea.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to talk about tonight, well, for additional context, when Mara asked me what I wanted to talk about at the winter release party, I said, Mara, you're giving me far too much power. But then I decided that I would talk about something actually serious that people other than I might have some care about or interest in. The subject that I turned to was community, which is something that I often find myself returning to in thoughts and discourse and conversation and in some of my writing sorts of things. And I felt that talking about the interrelationship between the church and communities in something of a historical bent might be something useful that some of you people might find interesting. So starting off, let's go back to the very beginning, a very good place to start. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 28 through 34. One of the scribes, when he came forward and heard them disputing and saw how well he answered them, asked him, "Which is the first of all the commandments?" Jesus replied, "The first is this, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, our God, is Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." The scribe said to him, "Well said, teacher. You are right in saying he is one, and there is no other than he. And to love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is worth more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that he answered with understanding, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And no one dared to ask him any more questions. Community matters. That's probably about as uncontroversial a take as you could offer in a gathering such as this. And this is something that saints and scholars and popes and priests and lay people have commented on over the entire history of the church. Some more recent examples include a chunk I pulled from Pope Francis in Laudato Si. Local individuals and groups can make a real difference. They're able to instill a greater sense of responsibility, a strong sense of community, a readiness to protect others, a spirit of creativity, and a deep love for the land. Social problems must be addressed by community networks and not simply by the sum of individual good deeds. And then going back a little bit further, but not too far, to Vatican II, we have a bit that I have pulled as well. "But God did not create man as a solitary being, for by his innermost nature, man is a social being, and unless he relates himself to others, he can neither live nor develop his potential." All very good points, and not points that we have always done the best job at living up to. For all of Christ's teaching on the importance of community, of caring for your neighbor, of looking out for one another, standing by everyone you meet, of the intrinsic value and worth of human life, a lot of individual Catholics and Catholic societies over the last 2 millennia have not always been very good at living up to the second commandment Christ gave us. And because I have a morbid fascination with colonialism, I decided that I would talk about 2 case studies, one where a society really did not live up to this, and one where a society did a better job of living up to this. Certainly not a good job, but a much better one, and in relative terms, a good job. Let's talk about New Spain and New France, which I had on the mind because it was Mardi Gras this week. So, the voice I I always forget what the proper name for a viceroyalty is. The province of New Spain encompassed the entirety of Spanish holdings in North America, and into parts of South America, if my mental maps of the 17th century world serve me well, which they don't always, so who's to say. But New Spain had its heart in what is now Mexico, and it was founded in the aftermath of the conquest of the Aztec empires and other nations in Mesoamerica. New France, of course, had its roots in what's now Quebec. It would spread later to Louisiana and the mouth of the Mississippi River. And these two societies, in certain ways, had a very common foundation. They were both the American empires of Western European nations, which were deeply Catholic, and where the church was at the center of society, at least in theory, as we'll see in practice, often not so much. And in spite of the somewhat similar, though certainly not common origins, the histories of France and Spain, that's a conversation that we could spend way too much time on and get very sidetracked on. Despite the commonalities that were there, the modes of society that emerged in the New World differed dramatically. Let's talk about New Spain first. The Spanish who came to the New World were broadly defined in two camps. There were the missionaries, and then there was everyone else. The missionaries came, and most of them were men of fervent faith, passion, goodwill, who truly sought to bring the light of Christ to the people they encountered. Everyone else was generally not so pure of heart. Politically, New Spain was founded in the name of power and profit. Its earliest settlers were the members of the landed gentry from back in Spain, men, and they generally were men, who had very little hope of further advancement because the holdings and the established position of the nobility meant that there was very little room for them to grow their own personal fortunes and little empires of territory in Spain itself. And so these men of the gentry, many of them conquistadors or friends of the conquistadors, came over and they established tracts of land for themselves in North America. The viceroys of New Spain, the king's representatives as governors of New Spain, they would grant favorable tracts of land, haciendas, to the gentry members who they were friends with or who they wanted favors from. The people who lived on those tracts of land were reduced to estates of serfdom. And the histories of New Spain are replete with cases of priests expressing their horror at the nature of life on the haciendas. The people who lived on these plantations and worked them, they had very few rights, very few powers, and serfdom in medieval Europe was certainly preferable to life on a hacienda. Exploitation was the norm, abuse was commonplace, and because of the disruption of the old patterns of farming and the old modes of life, hunger and famine were widespread across the colony. And the people who were living on the haciendas were in many ways the lucky ones. The unlucky ones were shipped to work in the silver mines, which swelled the coffers of Spain itself. And there's also the elephant in the room. Very few Spanish women moved to New Spain. And so, in the centuries following the initial Spanish colonization, society in New Spain came to be structured by a rigid casta system, where one's proximity to Spain, both in terms of direct connection to the Spanish homeland and in terms of one's racial heritage, defined your position in society, your opportunities for investment, advancement, how you could marry. Everything was governed by the rigidity of the casta. Now, the black myth of the Spanish Empire, as many historians call it, is a bit overplayed. There were plenty of good people in New Spain, there were plenty of loving marriages, and as the legacy of those old institutions in contemporary Latin America shows, there was a lot of bad and there was also a lot of good. Many of the people became fervently Catholic, and this is of course one of the most fervently Catholic regions in the world today. There was lots of good, but most of it was in spite of the prevailing political realities in New Spain. And for all the efforts of the missionaries, of the priests, there was very little that would be done during New Spain to try and substantively better the lives of the people on the ground, the communities that defined the population of New Spain. Was New France good? Definitely not, but it was a hell of a lot better than that. Now, New France is a story of contradictions in many ways. Very few French people wanted to move to what is now Canada. The winters were long and arduous. They would be thousands of miles away from home, away from their families, and there wasn't much in the way of opportunities to establish a thriving plantation for oneself. Part of that was the geographical realities of the St. Lawrence River Valley. Part of that was the indigenous people there, unlike the remnants of the Aztecs and the other peoples of Mesoamerica, were not entrenched in many cases in the same sort of broad-scale agriculture that would have made that feasible. And also because of the fact that trade on the North American continent had made them immune to many of the diseases that came over from Europe, the native peoples of the northern parts of North America were much more formidable adversaries. So Canada, Quebec, not really the biggest sell. And so the people who came to the St. Lawrence Valley, by and large, were the most destitute, the most hopeless, the worst off parts of French society. Most of the earliest emigres were the engagés, the engaged, which was what they called indentured servants, and the filles du roi, the daughters of the king, were orphaned women. Most of them came from either Paris or Nantes and the other cities in the north and the west of France. And this is where the irony kicks in. Because the standard of living in New France, in Quebec, was far better than the standard of living for the French peasantry back in the old country. The New French, in some ways, their lives mirrored those of their cousins and siblings, parents back home. They were bound to a plot of land that was owned, run by a seigneur, not a proper lord, but the equivalent of one. And the habitants, the peasantry, they had limited rights, limited political power, and they were bound in many ways to their landlord. However, for all the harshness at first glance of the environment in the St. Lawrence Valley, there was a lot of opportunity for advancement. The New French could cut as much firewood as they wanted, and so ironically enough, winters for them were warmer than for their countrymen who were not dealing with the Canadian winter. They were also allowed to hunt, allowed to fish, and their diets were much better. They ate more wheat. They ate more in general. And in the generations after they first arrived in the cold north, the New French spread along the St. Lawrence River Valley, and they established a number of thriving communities. Let's talk a little bit about civil society in New France. The church was at the center of civic life. Religious orders, mostly run by nuns, ran hospitals, asylums, and orphanages in Montreal, which was a standard of community infrastructure far beyond anything that existed in any other American colony from any of the European empires. Jesuit missionaries were central to the politics of New France, particularly to the diplomacy. For those of you who are interested in history, I would strongly encourage you to read some of the accounts from Jesuit missionaries who went down the St. Lawrence up into the Great Lakes and lived among nations like the Huron, because those are fascinating tales, and they successfully converted a heck of a lot of people. And even though the habitants were subjugated to the seigneurs had far less arbitrary power than their counterparts in France did, far less direct control over the lives of the people who lived on the land. It certainly was not egalitarian, but by the standards of the time, it was approaching that. And observers of the day would remark that the New French were among the politest, most modest, and most pleasant folk in any of the myriad American colonies of the different empires of the 17th and 18th century. That is also sugarcoating things quite a bit. There was plenty of violence that occurred. The Canadian winter was not a great time for many people, at least for a while. In the earlier generations, it wasn't a great time. But afterwards, the New French made it their most cherished time of the year. They would visit one another, they would drink, they would eat, they would sing and dance and tell stories deep into the night. Yes, if that's not the best society, I don't know what is.
Big Brian energy.
Yes, they would take sleighs too, Brad. They would ride in their horse-drawn sleighs, and they would go along the banks of the river.
Yeah,
Winter was a time of leisure for them.
Negative degrees.
Which makes sense because the three industries in this colony are farming, fishing, and fur trapping or trading. You can't farm from October to April in this part of the world. And so the busy season was April through October, and then the rest was time for leisure and feasting and enjoying the fruits of their labors from the busy part of the year. Yes. For all the harsh realities of life, for all the constant imperial wars, for all the iniquities there, New France is a lot more idyllic than New Spain was. At least if you like the cold, which I do.
Yeah, the confounding variable here is the temperature.
Indeed. Now we have reached the part where I ran out of time and wrote Eric Hoffer interlude. So I'm going to put my computer down for a while because I have no slides to go off. This is where I just riff. Here's a real hot take that I'm sure Brad will certainly not fervently agree with. The Industrial Revolution was a rather destabilizing thing. I am not one of the sorts of people who thinks that it was purely evil. I like living in a society with deodorant and toothpaste and advanced medicine. But the true destabilizing aspect of the Industrial Revolution is ultimately linked to the fact that it broke up communities. For the longest time, people had lived in Western Europe and in most of the world. Of course, Western Europe was where it kicked off first, so its effects were felt there first. People had lived in a common mode across the millennia. Most people lived on farms in the countryside or on the manors of great lords, which was the norm in most societies in Western Europe. And the communities that formed endured. For most of human history, there was very little in the way of nobility. By way of example, last names in the English language didn't really occur, to my understanding, until after the bubonic plague, which was another wildly destabilizing event. But things settled more after the plague than they did after the Industrial Revolution. For the first time, people began to move away from their homes. In England, they would move from the countryside, from the moors, from the tracts of land held by the great landowners, to London, to Manchester, to Leeds. They would move to these towns which became burgeoning cities, massive centers of industry, and they would be cut off from everything that they'd ever known. They would go to the city, they would find work, and the old communities that they had belonged to were not accompanying them there. And this is the sort of dynamic which is unavoidable in an industrial society where the old agricultural mode of existence fades out in favor of the industrial version. And what comes with this is the sense of hopelessness, this uprootedness, the loss of the concrete attachment, the loss of the network of humanity that defined one's early life. And it is in this sort of a scenario, it is among these masses of uprooted people that we see a lot of the things that we've seen over the last 150 years. We have seen the increasing salience of new political ideas, some of them good, others not so good. We have seen, well, authoritarianism is certainly not a new thing in human history, but the forms that it began to take towards the end of the 19th and especially into the 20th century were wildly distinct from that which had came before. And certainly not all of that is a function of the destabilization wrought by industry itself, but we see many of the great world historical events of the last 200 years being influenced profoundly by the nature of industry. Take the First World War, for example. Generations shattered by weapons crafted in the sorts of factories which had, depending on the country, 150 or 100 or 50, or even more recently, in the case of Russia, in many cases, begun to take root and shake up the old order. Throughout the 20th century, a lot of the great and terrible mass movements that we've seen in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, in parts of Africa and Asia, they stemmed out of the breaking of the old communities. Out of the shakeups that accompanied not just industrialization, but the events of the time. In the aftermath of as the Western empires began to decolonize in the middle of the 20th century, many wishful thinkers in those countries hoped that the former colonies would adopt democratic modes of living on the model of government in London, in Washington, in Paris. And in many of those cases, that was not to be. And part of it was the destabilization that the initial periods of colonization had wrought, and the destabilization that was wrought by the removal of the imperial overlord and the structures of power that defined life in those countries. Thinking about Africa and Southeast Asia in particular, the ways in which the British and French and other empires maintained their control, when removed, set the groundwork for the rise of dictators who promised a great national revival and revenge on the collaborators, whoever had benefited from the old imperial arrangements. Perhaps on par, in some respects, with the Industrial Revolution, would be the internet. I was talking with Carl Johnson, who was known to most of you earlier this week, and we were talking about the mental health of the uprising generation. That's a very strange turn of phrase there, the uprising generation. I'm very tired, bear with me.
Exactly. It works.
And Carl and I were talking about just the state of things in what is technically my generation, because I am past the cutoff, I am a Zoomer. But we talked about the ways in which mental health among young people in this country and across the Western world is collapsing. And so much of it seems to be a function of the utter isolation that most people feel. This comprehensive lack of a real community that drives people to seek refuge in something that approximates community. For many people, it's social media, scrolling through videos on the internet to feel that little spark of connection, seeing someone's face, seeing a smile, seeing someone sing or dance, that little bit that makes them feel something. Other people seek refuge in their politics, which, as someone who studies this stuff, that is a large part of why we see politics in this country going the way it is, with the tribalism and the constant back and forth, and the existential terms we use to describe things that are not necessarily existential. As someone who teaches people as my day job, I see it a lot, and it is disheartening in many cases to see just how profoundly bummed out so many of these kids are. These kids who, most of them were in high school when the pandemic hit. They spent years out of the classroom, learning remotely. And while I am not one of the people who said, oh, that's the worst thing that ever happened, it is fundamentally sad that these kids missed out on the opportunity to build the sorts of connections that sustain the human spirit. And I don't think the pandemic is purely responsible for that, not at all. This was going on long before that. The degradation of civil society in this country, accelerated by the onset of the internet and social media and all this stuff where, and this is another thing that I was talking about recently. Just today I was talking with some friends about my own hypocrisy on this sort of thing. Because I'm a big reader. I like reading a lot. But there will be evenings, more than I would care to admit, where I will say to myself, Brian, you know you will be happier if you put down the phone and just pick up a book. Make a mug of tea, pick up a book, read for an hour, go to bed. You will be much happier if you do. And then, oftentimes I wind up scrolling on my phone for 3 hours and getting to bed late and just making myself miserable.
It's your Zoomer showing.
Yeah. And it can seem very, very daunting. Like in my own life, seeing these kids, seeing just like snippets of how they're struggling. Obviously, I usually do not get lots of detail, but I can infer in some cases just how hard of times these kids are going through, and sometimes they do confide in me, and I feel very badly. So I don't always know how I can be of use, how I can be of help. I want to talk about a case study to close us out for the evening. I stumbled into a story recently about a married couple in Poland by the name of José and Victoria Ulma. The Ulmas were a married couple from Markowa, which was then in south-central Poland. It is now in southeastern Poland because the borders of Poland have changed, shifted westward since this point in time. They were pillars of their community. They were devout Catholics. They lived on a farm not too far from their town center. In addition to being a farmer, José was an amateur photographer, so for the time being, have a little visual aid. José was born in, I believe, around 1900. Victoria was born around 1910. And by the time World War II kicked off, they had 6 children born already, or maybe it was 3, or trying to think. I think it was, they had 5 or 6 children born by the beginning of World War II, and they would have 6 with 1 more on the way by 1943. The Olmos were pillars in their community. They were the sort of people who would never turn away someone who knocked on their door. In 1942, a family knocked on their door. They were the Sauls. They were Jews. And the Holocaust was kicking into full swing. The patriarch of the Saul family asked the Olmas, asked Joseph Olma in particular, if he would take in and shelter himself, his wife, and their 4 children. The Olmas agreed. They took in the 6 members of the Saul family, and they also took in 2 sisters of the Goldman family. Maybe the Guinness was a mistake. I'm getting choked up here. They sheltered them in the attic, and the Sauls and the Goldmans did their best to help out around the house, pick up odd jobs, to account for some of the costs that the Olmas incurred in sheltering them, feeding them, clothing them. In the early morning hours of the 24th of March, 1944, after almost 2 years of them being sheltered, the Germans came. It is not concretely known what happened. It is suspected that a member of the Blue Police, or the Polish police who collaborated with the Nazi occupiers, had sold out the Sauls, hoping to obtain some of their property, but we don't know this concretely. In any case, the Nazis came. They dragged much of the local community along to watch. They pulled the Olmas out of the house. They ransacked the house. They found the Sauls and the Goldmans. They dragged them out, and they executed them. They then executed Victoria, who was 7 months pregnant. They then executed Joseph. When the children screamed and wailed to see the bodies of their parents, after a brief discussion, the Germans killed them too. The mayor of the town was apparently on speaking terms with one of the German officers we had known through food requisitions earlier. He asked them why they had killed the children, and apparently with a wave of his hand, the Nazi officer said, so they wouldn't inconvenience you. The Germans' point was made quite plain to many of the people of Markova. A few other families had been sheltering Jews. Some of them killed those people and dumped their bodies in the fields to make sure they wouldn't be found sheltering Jews, to make sure they would escape the Olma's fate. But not all the Poles of Markova would betray their fellow men. The Olma's neighbors were a family called the Silers. And even though they had been dragged out to watch, the Silers continued to shelter 7 members of the Veltz family. They sheltered them to the end of the war until the Red Army came and drove the Germans back. All of the Silars and all of the Weltzes would survive the war. The Silars still live in Markova, The Veltzes live in Brooklyn. A campaign for the Olma's beatification began after the war, after their story became known. Their postulator found a Bible in their old homestead with the passage about the Good Samaritan underlined. On December the 17th of last year, Pope Francis decreed the martyrdom of Joseph and Victoria Olma and all 7 of their children. They are set to be beatified on September the 10th. Most of us are never going to face challenges remotely on the scale of a Nazi occupation. Most of us are never going to face such existential barriers to trying to build community, to help people in our communities. But even in our convenient lives, it's only ever too easy to ignore the knock on your door, to otherize your fellow man, to ignore the suffering of people right beside you in your community. And to that end, we could all stand to take a page out of the collective books of the venerable servants of God, Joseph, Victoria, Stanislava, Barbara, Vladislav, Franciszek, Anthony, and Mario. And the unnamed baby martyr as well. That, to the best of my knowledge, is the last picture of them together. Oh boy. I will leave you all with some words from the late Pope Benedict XVI in Deus Caritas Est. If I have no contact whatsoever with God in my life, then I cannot see in the other anything more than the other, and I am incapable of seeing in him the image of God. But if in my life I fail completely to heed others, solely out of a desire to be devout and to perform my religious duties, then my relationship with God will also grow arid. It becomes merely proper, but loveless. Only my readiness to encounter my neighbor and show him love makes me sensitive to God as well. Only if I serve my neighbor can my eyes be open to what God does for me and how much he loves me. And that rambling mess that it was what I had to say.